Serious, national park rangers and any other profession that takes you far out into the wilderness. What are the strangest, weirdest things you have seen or heard or experienced while out there? Worked an internship with an ex-forest ranger. He had a report of a missing man who had some ailments and needed daily meds. Anyways, found him at a deer blind, facing away. Matched the description, so they called out his name. No response. Called out again. Nope, the guy just sat facing the woods. My co-worker went and tapped him in the shoulder. Maybe he was sleeping? Nope, he was missing his face. Shot himself with a rifle. He was actually sick with cancer and went out to end it all. Poor guy. Backcountry Sahir. I haven't actually seen too many weird things in the wilderness. But when you're out in the middle of nowhere at night and you're exhausted, relatively normal things can be downright creepy at first. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was out on a search in the pine forests of northern Arizona following a trail that was more of a boot path than much else. As a result, I was focusing on the trail a good deal more than my surroundings. Looked up to see about 20-30 pairs of glowing eyes staring back at me, almost 360 degrees around me, and just about lost my crap for a second. Turns out we walked into an elk herd and they were just as startled as we were. I'm a fisheries biologist and I was out sampling a small brook stream under a bridge in the middle of nowhere. I looked down and thought I saw a pipe, but under further examination I saw it had what looked like testicles attached to it. So, I grabbed a couple sticks to pick it up and it turned out to be a giant purple dildo. I had never actually seen a dildo before, and finding one way out in the middle of the woods under a bridge of a dirt road was quite odd. It had the vein and everything, and it was like 12 inches long and at least 4 inches in diameter. Just huge. I just don't see how that could be enjoyable for anyone. Ecologist. I went to urinate in some bushes in grad school on campus and found giant double-sided dildo. It became my department's go-to dog toy at picnics. I worked at the Grand Canyon and I dropped my water bottle into the canyon, and then next day I was walking on that same trail and find my bottle on the side of the trail. Beat a heck. I was an infantryman in the army, so we got out into the field for days, weeks at a time pretty regularly. Once we're out there doing a patrol and we came into this clearing. There were all of these dolls of various sizes, similar to the ones in Blair Witch Project, hanging from the trees. This was out in the middle of freaking nowhere, a good 10 miles at least from any kind of public roads. It was pretty creepy. I'm working in developing aid, most of the time in rural Africa. Once I had to camp in the middle of nowhere, Tanzania, and our guard ranger apparently knocked himself out with a nice combination of weed and cheap local booze. Woke up in the middle of the night to sniffing sounds and low-pitched growling. Yelled into the darkness and just made all the noise I could, banging stuff etc. until I heard retreating footsteps. In the morning we found footprints and a steaming pile of crap just behind the tent. Could have been a hyena, jackal or lion. Literally scary crap. Sounds like you scared the crap out of it. Nothing weird or strange, but I was a tour guide at a national state park and I stayed in the ranger cabin because the commute was so far. We didn't have TV in the cabin, so I just sat on the porch. They're in the middle of the woods, at least 30 miles from a town, and there was nothing but nature. Anyways, the curiosity from the wildlife was astounding. I had deer walk right up to the porch and stare at me for a long time. Snakes would come up right beside me and sit on my legs like they weren't worried about me. Birds and squirrels showed a lot of curiosity as well, especially hummingbirds. It took me a while to get used to it and stay still when they did it, but they would come up and examine me and my face from within an inch. They like to hover there, just staring at your eye, darting back and forth, just examining all the wonders of your face. It was amazing. I really miss the solitude and the way those animals seemed so interested in me. I worked on a remote trail crew in Arizona 10 years ago. We hadn't seen anyone else for a full week until the man in charge of the park's pack mule team came riding into camp on a horse with a single mule behind him. He said the rangers sent him out to collect some human remains further up the trail. I did an internship in the Adirondacks with the deck, which basically entailed backpacking deep into the mountains and camping out for a few days at a time, helping lost hikers and making sure campers weren't destroying the sites or attracting bears. Cool way to spend a summer. The weirdest thing to happen to me wasn't creepy. It was just weird in a whoa, nature just talked to me directly kind of way. I tended to take it upon myself to pick up litter when I saw it along the trails. So this one time I was hiking down from a mountain top and this chipmunk ran out right in front of me. But instead of crossing the trail it stopped and sat on a rock and looked at me. I stopped and watched it because, you know, potentially rabid chipmunk. It wasn't acting rabid, though. Just ran past me up the trail behind me and hopped onto another rock. Stopped, looked at me again, then looked down at a plastic sandwich bag on the ground. I hadn't seen it. I said, oh, okay. Chipmunk ran off into the woods. I picked up the sandwich bag, put it in the garbage bag in my backpack and continued on down the trail. Call me a big hippie if you want. You're not really wrong. I did a lot of meditating on mountain tops that summer, but I always took that moment as the forest using a chipmunk to say, hey, you missed a spot. Reminds me of a Thoreau quote. I once had a sparrow alight upon my shoulder for a moment while I was hoeing in a village garden, and I felt that I was more distinguished by that circumstance than I should have been by any epaulette I could have worn. State park ranger here, and the oddest thing I've seen was a sex doll. One of the nicer ones, not inflatable, dressed in a wedding gown with a bullet hole in the chest. At first I thought it was a dead body, then when I got closer I realized it wasn't a body but a doll. The thing is, this spot is really tough to get to, and to bring something that big and dressed so that will get snagged a lot is just so freaking weird. My sister-in-law is a ranger of a national park in California. It amazes me how many times she finds people who have committed suicide. Just applied for a ranger position in a California park. While working as a wildland firefighter, our crew was on a fire deep into New Mexico. With that profession, you spend a lot of time on your feet and doing a lot of manual labor with little sleep. On the incident maps it's common to make notations of areas that are considered sensitive. This can range from areas with suspected known endangered species, known pot farms, and Native American land with cultural significance. So we were late into our shift. Can't even recall what day we were on, because typically assignments can last up to 14-28 days depending on need for resources. We were working with a Native American crew because our division went through culturally sensitive land. Everything was going good. Darkness fell, and it was coming up on break time eventually. We were all dead tired, sucking in smoke all day, little sleep, totally normal. Fire was pretty much out in our area, minus a few hot spots that just needed mopping up. As I was sitting against a tree, all of our normal radio traffic turned to nothing but static, which is totally common in areas that are out there. Fighting the urge to sleep, I got one of those moments that just wakes you up. Like when you wake up from a dream where you're falling. It was like that, but there were these figures, similar to the ghost of Obi-Wan. It's like they would walk behind a tree and disappear. Nobody else saw it, but I've heard similar stories before. I'm not a person who really believes in ghosts or paranormal stuff. I feel like it was real, but I do my best to believe that it was just a hallucination from lack of sleep. I was doing spawning ground surveys in the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho. About 3 miles into the trail I passed a camp, but no one was home. 3 days later on my way out I passed the same camp, but this time there was a guy there and a big blue tarp over something. The guy started asking me things but I couldn't hear him, so I walked closer. He was asking me if I wanted to buy a bear pelt or various bear internal organs. This guy did not seem right in the head and it was a very strange and unsettling interaction. I wanted out of there as fast as I could. I'm also pretty sure that the selling of wild animals parts is quite illegal, so I looked for a vehicle at the trailhead or any info that I could give to a game warden, but I came up with nothing. Yup, welcome to Idaho. Biological science tech here. Was hiking in a remote backcountry location where I found a cave with a glass crystal Buddha inside. It was decked out with flowers. The location was very remote and the flowers looked only a few days old. Rubbed Buddha's tummy for good luck, left it like it was and moved on. My daily dose of strange. I work as a field intern in the Panama Canal. We regularly hear howler monkeys, they're terrifying. And last week, I walked to the truck and saw a vulture not a couple meters away flying off carrying a meter-long red snake. All I could think was, this is it. This is how Mexico City began. I must build my city here, but there's not that much space between the canal and the jungle, so where? I was still in college, 21 years old I think, and working for the United States Forest Service in Oregon as a wilderness technician. During the summer, basically, I hiked around the woods for days on end clearing out logs, brush, etc. A good job for a 21-year-old. Anyway, one day I was out on my own during a day trip, and about 5 miles into a 8-mile trail loop, I was hiking around a bend in the trail, and about 200 feet ahead I see a big white boulder in the middle of the trail. I come closer and think to myself how strange it was to see such a big white boulder in the middle of the trail. Then the boulder starts moving up and down, up and down. What the heck? I say to myself. It was a butt. A big white butt. Some lady was riding the heck out of a man right there in the middle of the trail, 60 miles from the nearest vestige of civilization. To each their own. Once while hiking near the US-Canada border in Washington, I came across this man dragging 2 suitcases. He was sharply dressed in a suit and tie, although quite rumpled looking by the time I saw him, and he was not carrying any hiking equipment. For example, water. We were at least 15 miles from the nearest trailhead and over 30 something miles to the nearest populated area. The suitcases he was dragging were clearly heavy, too. He had to drag one forward about 10 feet, stop, go back, and then drag the next one up, and then repeated the process. When we passed, we asked if he needed any help. He insisted he did not, so we just went our separate ways. After landing in Seattle, D.B. Cooper directed the plane south towards Mexico City, with a refueling stop in Reno. He jumped out the plane somewhere near the Oregon-Washington border. While working for the Utah Conservation Corps, I went backpacking through Zion National Park. I found some sort of little shrine with an urn full of ashes. I assume that was someone's remains. Freaking otters make the scariest freaking noise at night, and the suckers are so small you can't identify what the frick made the noise. And when you turn to look for them, all you hear is the pitter-patter of featuring MR scary. Haha, that sounds terrifying but funny to hear about. An elderly lady with a giant pack and shopping bags that she was carrying on the final stretch of the PCT going to Canada. She was a good 10 plus miles from the last trailhead and doing terrible, could barely hike because she had so much stuff. Lady didn't know she was in a waterless section of trail and only had a liter for the rest of the day and an overnight. Really strange how she got out there. We told her to get off at Hart's Pass and told the ranger about her. Really weird because I was tripping. Not happy because I had to give her a fair amount of my water. Ecologist. I was in the middle of a wilderness area. Some stupid butt grad student tossed up some hobo units and a Campbell Dattiliger and didn't get a permit. Cue me walking 30 miles to yank them out. One of the most remote areas in the lower 48 of the US. Now, most of this area, even the non-wilderness, didn't even have radio repeaters. Really remote even for someone who works in places like that on the regular. I rode in helicopters fairly often. I'd say where, but I think it might dox me. This story got around. Anyway, we came across a gathering of about 100 ultralight aircraft and paraplanes, a dozen jeeps, in the middle of a fricking wilderness area, partying, beer, the whole 9 yards. I was P. The ranger got his butt out there and wrote a whole lot of tickets. Oh, here's a good one from me. I'll copy and paste it. Once I was doing a survey or a clearance along a river in the desert. I had to take a deuce like a mofo. I was holding it because I was getting near town where they dropped our truck off. It was only about 5 more miles but I was prairie dogging it. I came around a bend and someone had a pipe dumping raw sewage into the drainage. Well, frick it. I crap in the wash. A great big rock hard dehydration poop. A couple days later my boss called me and my co-worker into his office. It was just us 3. A guy on the fire crew had found a giant turd in a wash next to his father-in-law's house and wanted to know what it was from. He thought mountain lion. My work of art was sitting in a Ziploc on my boss's desk in a federal office. Word got around about that one. Years later in school I mentioned that I worked in this office location to someone who had worked in AK at the same time and they asked me if I knew the guy who crap in the wash. Now I'll leave a little indication it was human, like some TP. I was prairie dogging it. Took me a few seconds to get what you meant as I'm not a native speaker, but when that mental image hit me I lolled hard. I'm neither of these, but my late grandpa ran a hunting lodge about 40 miles west of McKinley in Alaska for many years. Decently remote place. The closest towns were through some pretty treacherous. By land, air travel was much easier but had small windows of opportunity. Mountain passes. One summer, when I was about 7 years old or so, we had a couple of guys wander into the lodge with folding bicycles. They weren't very well geared for hiking or roughing it, and apparently they thought there was cycling trails from Fairbanks to No More Barrow or something. We fed them, let them sleep in one of their hunter cottages, and then they went on their way. I still wonder what happened to them sometimes. Denali. Thanks, Obama. It is not particularly remote, but definitely in one of the less traveled or less accessible areas of my park, and in no particular order. Small piece of plastic trash. Picked it up to realize it was a used tampon applicator. Gatorade bottle full of fermented fesses. Plastic bag. By now I knew not to blindly pick it up. Containing soiled pants. People are gross. I have also found homeless camps, old lean to shelters and what I presume to be some kind of ceremony sites, crystal points, candles, incense. I have found bicycles on top of 300-foot cliffs, 3rd 4th class, on 2 occasions. My favorite was probably locating some 500-year-old petroglyphs. I've found a number of lithics, stone artifacts, and ancient campfires, too. This makes me think of the time my uncle crapped himself on a canoe trip and accidentally flung his dirty underwear into a tree to hide them, only for my other uncle to find them on the way back. I used to be a wildlife biologist. On my first job out of college, I was surveying spotted owls in Northern California. Our survey protocol had us out on ATVs just after sunset, stopping periodically to mimic the owl's hoot and listen for their response. One night, I was riding my ATV on a logging road that was right along a river. I saw a blur off to the side, and before I knew it, there was a smallish black bear running 5 feet ahead of my ATV. I immediately slowed down to avoid hitting it, but since it was so small, I thought its mother might still be around, so I was half expecting a mama bear claw in my back. The bear ran ahead of me on the road for probably 5 seconds. It felt like much longer, before disappearing into the forest on the other side. As soon as the road was clear, I pounded the throttle on the ATV and got out of there. In retrospect, the bear was probably a yearling, and no longer with its mother, but in the heat of the moment it was a terrifying possibility. We've found bones buried in shallow graves that get exposed during monsoon season. 15 bodies in 3 separate sites in the last 5 years. We finally found an ID from one of them. It was from the early 1980s. We think all the bodies are illegal aliens. Unfortunately it's on an Indian reservation so the killer will most likely never be found. I would like to go out into the woods with my son, but I remember a few stories when this was asked before. 2 guys camped by a lake in the boonies. They see a light coming around the lake. They hide in the bushes. Some dude shows up. I think he said the guy threw his friend's pack in the fire. They haul butt. But here's another question, and maybe someone has some more info about it. Last week in Texas, a guy murdered like 4-6 people that were camping. It was said he had helped pull them out of the mud earlier. A couple of bodies were found in a nearby pond. Does anyone have any details about this? Did the murderer know the people? Or was this like some Friday 13th Crystal Lake murder scene in which some guy just slaughtered a bunch of sleeping campers? Stuff like this keeps me out of the woods. This happened like 20 minutes from my hometown. Apparently the guy helped pull them out of the mud with his tractor, then was drinking and socializing with them. Lost it. Killed everyone except the grandmother, who somehow managed to hide in the woods. Then threw all their bodies in a pond, including a 6-year-old boy. Terrible. When I was in college I worked a few summers for Philmont Scout Ranch in the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico. Basically a huge backpacking camp. One day me and a group were called out on a missing person search. We hiked most of the night looking for this kid in a fairly remote area. We had a sector to cover and we would shout out his name as a group periodically. We were hiking up a conchal trail on a steep slope and rounded a sort of U-bend. We called out the kid's name and looked back across the U-bend to the other side of the canyon. We saw two faint red and blue lights that seemed to look like headlamps right above the section of trail we had just hiked past. We figured the kid had heard us and were relieved. Half the team stayed at that spot to observe the lights and be spotters on the radio, and the other half went back to investigate. I was in the half that was spotting. We watched the other half of the team head to the other spot. The lights vanished as they approached. The team reported seeing or hearing no signs of anyone in the spot where we had seen the lights. Maybe it's not the spookiest thing in the world, but I'm convinced those were not human lights, and I get the willies just thinking about it. I've returned to that spot multiple times. It's in a location that scouts, or trespassers, for that matter, would have no business or reason to go to. It just freaks me out because I'm a pretty hardcore skeptic on paranormal type things, and I can't come up with an explanation of what those lights were. I was once doing some conservation work in a wilderness area in Idaho for an internship. After a day or so we discovered what appeared to be the skeleton of a human arm with the second two segments cut off each finger. We had a few people hike out to report the incident, which was a pain since it was a pretty long hiking out. As it turned out, it was a black bear arm. I guess the bones in a black bear's arm closely resemble those of a human, and sometimes hunters cut the ends of the finger digits off. Still pretty creepy though. This isn't so much strange as it is mildly interesting. Knowles grad here. Did a 35-day backpacking course in the Kimberley region of Australia. During my solo, in which I spent 48 hours all by myself, I woke up from a remarkably disappointing and tame case of sleep paralysis to see a very, very bright star in the north. It cycled between purple, blue, yellow, and white and was very pretty. I watched it a while before going back to bed, but I never looked for it again. I live in the UK, so we don't really have wilderness per se, but I used to work at a falconry centre on an estate with several thousands of acres of land, which is about as close as it gets. Anyways, one day I was taking an especially antisocial bird out for training to try and get her to at least tolerate people for experienced day flights. I took her a bit further out than I did with most birds as she's quite dominant and we didn't want any dead birds on our hands. In the middle of the particular field I was planning on flying her in was half a sheep. It had been torn apart by something, and given the state of the body it was recent, as in within the last couple of hours. There's nothing in the UK even close to large or powerful enough to do that kind of damage. I just turned round and left, never spoke about it, didn't want more deciding to have her fill on the sheep. Could have been the hunt, but there'd be nothing left of the sheep if it were. I don't know what else it could have been. There's nothing in the UK even close to large or powerful enough to do that kind of damage. Clearly there is something I am not a national park ranger, but I worked for a season in Yellowstone National Park. They have dorms and it was mainly a bunch of us college kids working there. One morning I woke up and went to work like normal. I work as a server in the dining hall which overlooked this huge field where bison elk tended to gather. I noticed there were tons of people surrounded the field as well as tons of rangers, and a bunch of bison. When I got closer I noticed one of my co-workers was passed out drunk in the middle of the field, completely surrounded by bison. One was seriously right next to his head. The rangers were trying to get to him but there was just too many bisons. Tourists were taking pictures. It was nuts. The rangers were finally able to get to him and he got fired, but it was one of my favorite memories. Also, like I said, there was a lot of partying and many people did drugs. There were rumors all season that the rangers would bring drug dogs into the dorms, and one day for some reason rumors spread it was the day. So many people went off into the woods to find a place to bury their crap. One kid said he walked 6 miles into the wilderness paranoid as heck trying to find a spot. The funny part was that most of them hid their crap so well they could never find it again. Oh, and drug dogs never roamed our workplace dorms. Not a park ranger, but when I was in the Boy Scouts we took a trip to a really remote location out in the middle of the woods. Not on trail. We had to use a topographical map and a compass to get there. When we got there, one of my friends was about to lean up against a tree that was in the middle of the campsite, and I had to stop him because the entire tree was literally pulsing with those daddy long legs, completely covered. There had to be thousands on this tree. It was the weirdest, and possibly the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. One time I went into a cave in Pennsylvania only to discover that the walls and ceiling were covered with harvestmen daddy long legs. It looked like cave pubes. The creepiest part was that they were alternating between squatting and standing in perfect rhythm. I worked for the US Forest Service for a bit in a pretty desolate area that attracted a handful of hunters come fall. One camp I stumbled up on just had a giant bathroom area about 15 yards behind their camp where they had all of their dirty toilet paper in a pile. They had been there for almost 10 days, so it looked like a giant nest made of crappy TP. One of the more foul things I've seen. Also lots of dead animal carcasses. One time just a pile of deer flesh and organs from hunters who had taken the meat on site and just left the animal there. The organs were in a plastic bag. In the military training areas in Louisiana they have huge herds of wild horses, numbering in the hundreds. I've watched them fighting for mating purposes, and they would kick and punch each other, and soon as one fight would stop another would begin like some crazy tournament. Also sat out a sandstorm deep in the Al Jazeera desert in a Humvee. At first it was cool, but it starts to frick with your head after a few hours. Boy Scout camp staff. May not seem like much, but when it's a 2-hour drive to the nearest town, the situation is very much like being a park ranger. Craziest thing I've experienced would be when we had to chase a bear out of camp using shotguns with blanks. No campers at the time, and it was hella fun. I've heard stories about when the drunks from a nearby campsite try to visit. One guy woke up camp at 2 AM with bagpipes, and another rode a unicycle, naked, while holding 2 lit road flares, down the steep hill we keep staff cabins on. Some injuries can get weird. I've seen more than enough unfit people go into serious heat exhaustion or serious cramping or whatnot because they don't think climbing that hill'll be hard. Like lady, we've been here for 3 months and we've acclimated to the temps and the elevation and we still find it hard. And you've been here since last night and haven't done anything but sleep so far. Also, on one of the seriously exhausting hikes we do, I'm talking 3 miles one way, with an elevation increase of 1 mile, but total elevation change of about 1.5 because of ups and downs. We had a woman take a selfie stick. Not a huge deal. Then she fell off a cliff trying to use it and having it throw off her balance. She was fine, but she skidded down the rock about 30 feet, so obviously not in the most comfortable of states. This was about halfway into the hike too. I've also seen some awesome stuff though, like when the group of super fit 70 and 80-year-olds went on the aforementioned hike and completely wrecked the staff who led them. Like they pushed him really hard. It was crazy. Mad respect for those who keep themselves in that good a shape that late in life. My goodness, this camp sounds like more fun than I ever had in Scouts. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.